I guess we should move on quickly because we've got drug legalization, and we
do have drug legalization.
I have to ask you because I'm an enormous fan of The Wire, and you grew up in West Baltimore.
Yes.
So I mean, first of all, like, what is your opinion of that show?
Well, The Wire is. The funny thing about The Wire is, and I was talking to Jake Weisberg about this, is all the people who think The Wire is the greatest television show ever generally don't watch much television. So I don't know how much our opinions are worth, but I'm going to go ahead and say it's probably the greatest thing I've ever seen on television. The interesting thing is, one of the things that I think never comes across when we have these discussions about poor people is there are different levels of poverty. I mean, The Atlantic ran this great piece on Section 8 vouchers this past month. And one of the things in there was, Hannah Rosen, who's a reporter, was talking about how people, when they were moving out of the projects with Section 8, were actually, destabilizing stable, poor communities.
Right.
And though she didn't spend too much time, talking about what that meant, that had a special ring for me because I, lived in one of those sorts of communities, stable, working class, lower middle class community. And I'm jumping off on a tangent. I promise to get back, after I just make this quick statement.
No, we're all about tangents here at Blogging Heads.
Okay, that's great. That's excellent. Because I go on many tangents. But, one of my great problems when we talk about African Americans is we tend to focus on those who are in the most extreme poverty, as though that is the ultimate, concept of what African American identity is in this country, or how, African American lives are lived out. The Wire, pretty much lived in that territory, which I really didn't have a problem with because it was so well done. And I guess I would say I probably came up in that, next tier of West Baltimore. Folks who, did not worry about, clothes on their back, didn't worry about having food on the table, or those sorts of things. Probably could have had cable TV if my father didn't hate TV so much. You know what I mean? But we really didn't have cable TV in the house. We barely had TV in the house. But I say all that to say that when you're in that position, you're still intimately acquainted with people who are just completely broke down. I mean, just totally broke down. You usually go to zone schools, certainly for elementary and middle school, so you sort of see them in your schools. The neighborhoods, where they live are just, right across the way. There's always a portion of that sort of population right within your neighborhood. And so to that extent, I thought I was pretty fairly familiar, not only with the larger Baltimore, but what The Wire was trying to represent. And they, I got to say, did a damn good job. I mean, they really, really, got it. And just the whole complexity of people, because that's the other part of it. It's like if you're poor, then you become flat. You're one thing. And I don't think I've ever seen a show take poor people, black or white or anything, and just expand them and give them so much humanity, and so much dimension. I think, if my personal politics are sort of, as crazy as this sounds, kind of beside the point. With me, right? I mean, there's this great debate about should we have more positive images of black people on TV, in literature, in movies. Which I think is beside the point. What I want is more human portraits. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you can be a guy. I mean, one of my favorite guys on The Wire is a guy who's basically a hitman who killed, tons of people. There's character Weebay. People will remember Weebay. I love the Weebay. I thought he's a great, great character. And I wasn't, sort of interested in this whole debate of, is Weebay a bad reflection of the black community? It's a human reflection. Which to me was the most important thing.
One of my favorite characters was Bodie for the same reason. There's that moment.
Bodie was great.
Spoiler alert, but there's that moment in the first season where he's about to shoot Wallace.
Yeah.
And I was sitting there, I was like, and I was rooting for him to do it. Not because I wanted Wallace dead, I liked Wallace, but because that's what he would have done. Like, I felt like that was the honest thing to do for the character. Right. And the amazing thing was, after he does that, I don't know if like is the right word. It's almost irrelevant whether you like him or not. It's just
it is irrelevant.
He's a person. He's a full person, and you just feel like he does good things and bad things, and that's so rare that you can really have the. I think it may be the most human portraits of rich. I don't think I've ever seen a portrait of rich people that was that sort of like full and unflinching. And so I loved the show, but I mean, of course, like. What it's about is the drug. It's particularly resonant for libertarians because I mean, I assume that that you, like me, grew up at least sort of knowing where the drug trade in your neighborhood was.
Yes.
Even if you didn't, I certainly didn't go buy drugs from the people by Riverside or whatever, but I knew where the drug dealers were.
Right.
And you saw them, right? Like, there weren't that many of them in my neighborhood, but they're definitely, they were there, you kind of knew they were there, and they did affect things.
Right.
And, my take, I'm a complete hard decriminalization. I think everything should be decriminalized. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. If you want to have it sold through government stores so that you can't get it until you're 18, that's fine.
Right.
But aside from that, I'm absolutely because I think that the social, and I'm not one of the libertarians who tries to argue that more people won't do drugs. I think more people will do drugs.
Right.
But I would say a couple things. Is first of all, in my experience, getting addicted to drugs is usually something that happens to people who are already screwed up in some way. I've rarely seen someone really seized by alcoholism or drugs who didn't have something else going on in their life,
who would have been
not be able to get out
otherwise.
Of it. I know people who have flirted with a cocaine habit for 9 months and felt really bad about it, and felt like it took them to a place they didn't want to be, and it was hard to get out of. In the same way that I know people who smoked for years and so forth, but I don't know anyone who had a long-term problem with drugs that they really couldn't kick. Who wasn't? I could have picked those kids out in ninth grade.
Right.
Not all of the kids that I would have picked out as being targets for drug problems went on to have them, but all of the kids that went on to have them would have been kids that I would have picked out as being people who could be among that group. And so I don't think that we're going to get a huge flood of people completely ruining their lives on this stuff, just because most people that I know who've tried cocaine, they tried it, and maybe they do it infrequently, or they did it a lot for 6 months, and then they just kind of go, you know what, I've got a life to lead, and this is not going to help me. And so I'm not sure that we would get this huge influx of drug addiction that people suspect, but I also think that the social costs of the drug war,
the violence is just, oh my God.
The violence, the fact that how many black men now have been in prison?
Yeah.
And that's crazy. And you think what happens to a felon when they get out of prison? Right. And this is something I have no idea how to fix, but I think it's a tragedy. What do it's sort of rational not to want to hire a felon, but on net, these people are ruined. Their lives are just crushed by something they may have done when they were 18. When I don't know about you, I was a moron at 18. I am so glad that what I did at 18 is not following me around for the rest of my life the way a prison conviction would have.
Right.
So I'm just hard legalization, not because I think that there are no social costs to legalizing, but I just think that the violence, the devastation in poor communities, and I also think that Mark Kleiman said this on another Blogging Heads that I did with him, that in some ways what we're doing is the costs of the drug war are mostly borne by the poor, and the benefits are mostly accrued by the middle class. I think that there's something really there. I mean, that's arguably true of many policies, but I think in this particular case, it's sort of particularly reprehensible considering that the costs are prison and death.
Yeah, and I think, and this just comes from living in neighborhoods. I mean, what I fear. I mean, I guess I'm not trying to say I admire crack dealers, but what I fear most is the shooting. I mean, I'm one of these people where I feel like, gun violence probably should be penalized very heavily, but I don't, know how much I begrudge you trying to make a buck. I mean,
right.
I fear my son being around drug dealers, not because of drugs per se, but I greatly fear the violence. We had a shooting in Harlem where violence has greatly declined here, by the way. I mean, from what it was, I'm sure, during your time, when you were living in New York. But where a guy just rolled up Lenox Avenue, just randomly shooting at people. I want those people out of my neighborhood. I desperately want those people out of my neighborhood, But I'm not clear that, that drug policy, that the drug in and of itself is the problem as much as the actual, the shooting. I mean...
Well, I've had this conversation with, an economist who's basically arguing that, that you look at anywhere that's poor and you get gangs, and if it's not drugs, it'll be something else. I'm not sure how much I buy that. I mean, if you look at prohibition in America, violence spikes in American cities. because there's something worth fighting over, and there's something to fund the guns. Like it's not really worth having gangs over like the local bread distribution on Lenox Avenue, right? This is not like a lucrative trade that they can use to fund gigantic stashes of weapons. So, and it's just not worth it, right? Like at that point, you might as well just go get a job doing something else,
right?
So I guess my feeling is that I think that the shootings, if you decriminalize the drugs, like I think we agree, the shootings are worse than the drugs, and if you decriminalize the drugs, you will lose much of the incentive for the shootings.
Yeah, and also, I'm sorry if I sounded sort of distracted when I was talking, it's because I was looking for this New York Times article just so I made sure I had my stats right. But that was the piece that they did in May. I mean, look, it's 4 out of 10 of all drug arrests are for marijuana possession.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it's just shocking. I mean, and I'm like, I guess I'm a lefty, but I'm a big fan of cops. I'm a big fan of cops coming hard down on people who make my neighborhood unsafe. I have absolutely no problem with that, but I want that energy, spent on other things. I mean, that's my problem with it. I'm not one of these people who feels like, I don't want cops in my neighborhood, or I don't go for that. I just want it directed to the people who are necessarily, making my neighborhood unsafe, especially when you consider that, the other part of it being, it's not like there's this great racial disparity in terms of drug usage. I mean, there's a huge one in terms of drug arrests,
right? But
not in terms of who actually uses drugs. I mean, I think, this discussion often gets weighed down into, other debates about, is the justice system racist? Is it this? Is it that? I don't particularly like to go there, because the fact of the matter is, when a lot of these laws were enacted, if you had to poll folks in the black community, they supported these laws. I mean, a lot of,
the crack laws were enacted. The crack laws were enacted at the behest of the Congressional Black Caucus. They
Exactly. So I don't necessarily go for that debate, but in terms of, is it actually effective? Is it good policy?
I think it's... There's a great blogging heads that we should link, because Mark Kleiman completely disagrees with me, and he studies drug policy for a living, and I think his... I think the honest choice is to say, like, for me, it's not good policy. It's just not,
right.
It would be nice if people didn't use drugs, but this is just not, it's not worth the cost that we're imposing on people. And I think that a lot of it is, right, if you're 16 and you're poor, and you don't have parents standing behind you and pushing the way you and I did. I mean, I wasn't poor, but if you don't have those parents standing behind you and pushing, right, in the short term, selling drugs seems kind of appealing.
Right.
And it enables, having this big fund enables people to make bad long-term decisions that may be rational short-term decisions.
Right.
So I would just like to take that off the table.
The other question I have, I should say for the record, I wasn't poor either.
I didn't know. I assumed you weren't, but I didn't want to.
No. But there's this whole thing. I don't want. I feel like one of these days what's gonna happen. Is someone's gonna blow me up and be like, Ta-Nehisi Coates didn't grow up poor. He had 2 parents who worked. So I don't want to. Like I was claiming street cred because I came up poor and I made it up out of the hood or something like that. I don't want anybody thinking that.
I'm going to lose my when I was coming up through the hard streets of the New York City independent school system.
So the other question I have, and I wonder what you think about this just as an economist, how much of that comes from the fact, the appeal you were saying, how much of it is the real world, money benefit of it, and how much of it is the fact that you are doing something that is forbidden? In other words, were it not forbidden, how would the drug dealer as an archetype be seen within, communities? I wonder how that would alter it.
Yeah, like if you were just selling Italian ices.
Yes, you basically selling Italian ices, right?
The Italian ice wars of 2004 go down in history as
would it still be a mythical? I have to say, certainly, when I went to school, when I one of the big sources of competition for girls when I was in high school were the older drug dealers. I mean, that was definitely, and it was certainly something lucrative about them being drug dealers. I think I can say that. But what if they were just like the guys who sold cigarettes on 125th? Like if it became like that? I mean, how much?
Yeah, I think they would be like pathetic, right? Like if you were not doing something to a high schooler. I don't think that. I think the guys selling cigarettes on 125th Street are awesome because they're they're entrepreneurs trying to get ahead.
Right.
But the thing is, if it weren't illegal, it wouldn't have any glamour.
Right.
It's not like this stuff is so exciting that it's not like being a pharmacist is not a glamorous job.
Right.
So I completely
no disrespect
agree with you.
to pharmacists.
Yeah, we're glamorizing for kids, both for boys and girls. We're glamorizing the drug trade because it's dangerous and illegal. Mm-hmm. And if they were like the guys, selling fake purses on 8th Avenue, no one wants to date those guys, right? Like they don't carry guns to work.
Right.
they carry change purses. That's not cool.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's also a factor. It's just that the glamour of the drug trade sucks people into it, in a way that, like, I mean, even in college, right? Even in Ivy League school, the guy who sells drugs on the side. Okay, he's kind of seedy, but at the same time, there's something vaguely romantic about the fact that he's dangerous and does something illegal. I did not myself date any drug dealers, to my knowledge, but I can see why people would have, and I can see how the guys who would do stuff that was illegal, even if it was only like, drinking and driving their cars too fast, they would. Some girls were like, that's lame, but other girls were like, ooh, let me get in the car and go drunk driving around the roads of Philadelphia. How clever.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think absolutely the air of danger just makes it worse. I mean, like, I'm curious, what do you think would... the interesting thing to me is what would happen to those people if drugs were legalized? What would happen to the people who hung out on our street corners when we were growing up if they had to go sell purses for a living?
Well, wouldn't they would be put out of work if drugs were legal, because I'm assuming some sort of mainstream or corporation or something else, like if you would get drugs, like, so the corner boys would be put out of business, right? I mean, that's the first thing.
So what would they do, though? What would they have done with themselves if they did not have drugs to provide money?
That's a good question, and someone who would make the argument against legalization of drugs would say that they would turn to, say, violent crime or robbery.
Right.
I'm not convinced of that. I'm not sure that that's what would happen.
I'm not sure either, because I don't think mugging is glamorous either. Like, I don't think mugging is nearly as glamorous as being a drug dealer.
You're right. Being a mugger, yes, you're correct about that. You're correct about that.
I don't know. I don't hang out with a lot of muggers.
No, but I can tell you when think about it like this. I mean, certainly, on The Wire, Omar was sort of glamorous. He was, that's true. But then again, he robbed from drug dealers, so I guess that's not.
Right.
I will just say this. When I was in high school, certainly the drug dealers were much more competition. No one went around saying, I want to date a stick-up kid. Like, that wasn't what was said. I want to date a mugger. Like, that really didn't... the mugger doesn't have the same archetype as the drug dealer, very few gangster rappers, rap about being muggers. They do rap about being stick-up kids who stick up drug dealers. But there are very few who rap about, I'm a mugger. When I come in the club, I'm going to stick you up. They're very, I guess there is some of that, but it's certainly not as large as, the drug dealer motif.
Well, because it doesn't feel, right, like taking on, like, mugging me. It's like you're not really playing against the varsity there. Whereas, like, if you take a drug dealer, like, they're prepared for it, and they're looking out for it all the time, and they have guns, too.
Right.
Whereas if you mug me, I'm just going to be like, here, Mr. Mugger, please take my wallet. Is there anything else I can do for you? How do we make it so that I don't get shot? Help me help you.
Right.
And so, I think that, like, the glamour is, in some sense, that you're doing something kind of tribally brave, right?
Mm-hmm,
like, you're doing something that's dangerous to you, and something that is, like, and you're taking on, like, almost a worthy adversary. You're taking on other drug dealers. You're taking on the cops. You're not taking on little old ladies who just got their Social Security check.
Right, exactly.
So I think is our time up? Do we have time for our last topics?
Do we?
You guys go for as long as you guys
want. Okay.
We're at an hour.
We're at an hour. Do you want to talk about the last topic? It's really on you, so it's your decision. I would love to hear about it.
How did I go?
Hear about it anytime. It's up to you.
How did I go from being a lefty to being a mild conservative?
I'm so interested in this.
I was kind of a dilettante lefty, I have to say. I was, I was in ACT UP, I was in Green Action, I was in a bunch of and I pro-choice groups and so forth. And I went to demonstrations, and I had my political consciousness raised many people tried hard to raise my political consciousness. I think most of them feel that they failed miserably. But when I was between my junior and senior years of college, I worked for a group called PIRG, which is a
what, Megan? What was it called?
It's called PIRG, PIRG,
Okay.
the Public Interest Research Group. Actually, Obama worked for one of the PIRGs. He worked for NIPIRG.
Gotcha.
And I have such a loathing for PIRG because the whole thing is just this and so I went in very idealistic. I was going to campaign for the environment. I was going to get paid, and then you go in and it's this just gigantic dishonest money machine. And it, over the course of a summer, I started to see like how a professional activist group works, which is that most of it is about getting money. Not the grassroots stuff. The grassroots groups are different, but the professional groups, the groups that do this for a living, 95% of what they do is just getting money in order to raise more money. And the money doesn't end up going anywhere. They say they do research and so forth, but that's a very small part of what they actually do, and the research is kind of at the level of like things that an undergrad could do with access to Google.
Okay.
So that was part of it, but it wasn't the whole part. So I started to get disillusioned. Anyway, they wanted me to campaign. They were doing like a trial campaign on national health care, and they wanted me to be one of the testers for a week. Mm-hmm. And sort of, I read about it. I went to the library and read about it, and I sort of thought, maybe this isn't such a good idea. And the reaction to maybe this isn't such a good idea was unbelievably fierce. Mm-hmm. And at this point, I'd already had a friend who was sending me Ayn Rand books, and also, actually, I have to say, like, possibly the real transitional moment was that same year. I was reading P.J. O'Rourke's Parliament of Horrors. Okay. And it is the sad thing is this book was written in 1990, and it is still like the descriptions of government programs are still basically true. Wow. They're all basically true. Yeah, like the poverty stuff, not so much, but everything else, like the farm program and like very stupid government regulations and Social Security and so forth. The stuff he was writing about 20 years ago is exactly the stuff that I write now. But he was doing these descriptions of, for example, the Supreme Court flag burning case, and I was laughing at them. And I started reading them aloud to my boyfriend and my roommate, and they were just like, "Why is that funny? I don't understand." And and I started to realize, like, the ridiculousness of thinking that the solution, that the fact that there is a problem implies that there is necessarily a solution to that problem. And I think that's sort of like the core of arguments that I have over and over with liberals, where we'll say something like, global warming's bad, and I'll say, like, I really think it's unlikely that we're going to get a good political solution to it. I'm hopeful, I'm happy to sign on when you go to lobby for this stuff, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Wait, hold on. I want to. Can I just quickly philosophically differ with you?
Okay.
Just because I'm very interested in your response. What is the case against trying to figure out what the solution is? Like, what is the case against? This is just from a liberal perspective of saying, okay, maybe we don't know what the solution is. Maybe we don't have the best solution right now, but it's worth it to work on it and try to get to a solution?
I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I guess what it is, it's like a don't just stand there, do something idea, right? I have identified a problem, therefore there must be a solution, therefore whatever I happen to be able to, the best thing I happen to be able to think of right now is the solution that we should do. And there's, I think that for libertarians, there's a lot of reasons that I'm libertarian. I mean, I have, there's Friedrich Hayek, the idea of spontaneous emergent order, that in general, central planners just don't have the information that they need to make good decisions for people. I think that, there's a liberty argument. I think, and I've been talking about this with the feminists a little bit, is I consider myself a feminist in the sense that I think that there is still discrimination. I think privilege exists. I think women do not have as much autonomy as they should to be able to sort of lead as full lives as they could if society were set up slightly differently.
Okay.
And I think that men have sort of more choices about their lives in a lot of ways, but I also think that there are choices that men should have about things like staying home that they don't really have now. And, maybe it is true that biology is driving a lot of that and we'll never get to the point, but I think we still have a long way to go before we can say that we're really in an environment that allows us to decide that it's biology.
Right.
And so, but the thing is, like, I think lots of things are important. I don't think that women's equality is so important that, for example, we should go and do something like, Barack Obama has now been pushing the idea of comparable worth again. Mm-hmm. That's a massive infringement on liberty. It's going to be hugely economically costly. It's not going to work very well. It's going to set up this gigantic new government bureaucracy that is sort of going to spend an enormous amount of time. Price control, that kind of price control bureaucracy always breaks down. It's always a disaster. And so there are other things that are also good, like economic growth, like personal freedom. Like if I were to go out and mandate that no one is allowed to disagree with me on, say, race or gender, mm-hmm. Maybe I would feel like the world would be a better place. But that's a massive cost to human liberty for me to be able to go out and say, like, no one's allowed to say anything that I disagree with.
Right, but no one's proposing that, right? I mean,
no, I'm not saying that they are. I'm just using it as like a thought experiment. That
okay.
There are lots of ways to enhance women's liberty that are themselves worse than the problem of women's inequality, even though the problem of women's inequality is high. And I think that for libertarians, and just in a lot of cases, the cure is worse than the disease. And I value personal liberty really highly. I think the government should have the burden of proof that what they're doing is really necessary. And so the obesity thing is a good example, I guess. For a lot of people, they look at it and they're like, well, people are overweight, and if we did these sort of 9 things, we could sort of push them towards not being overweight. But for me, you're giving the government then this power that I really don't want them to have to decide how people should look, how much they should weigh, what is a good weight, and that they're authorized to shape our environment to funnel us into the choices that sort of the majority has decided we should make. Now, sometimes you have to do that. So there are lots of areas, right, where we need to cooperate, where where people are interacting. But my weight is personal. My weight, you are not if I get fat, even if I, make myself ill, this is not your business. Fundamentally, I just feel that there are a lot of areas that are not your business. And then I think there are a lot of other areas where
let me throw a quick devil's advocate point to you though.
Okay.
What if you're going to be in a neighborhood like mine where people's weight actually does, it sends them to the emergency room, for instance, which actually is going to cost me money.
But I think this is a problem there, right? So the government gives you health care, and then the government says, well, now that I've given you health care, the government forces you in some sense to take it. Now that I've done that, I'm your daddy. Or your mom.
But those people wouldn't want to not be able to go to the emergency room.
Right, but I think that, I guess I think in the same way that, right, I can make an argument that some conservatives had made, right, that if a woman goes on welfare, she should have to be on birth control so that she doesn't have more kids while she's on welfare. Mm-hmm. And I can make a justice argument about that, right? If you're mm-hmm. expecting someone to support your child, justly, you should not then go have more children for them to support. It's one thing if something happened to you that you couldn't foresee. It is another thing to have children that you can't support, that you were expecting someone else to go and work to support.
Gotcha.
The problem is the space that requires the government to intrude into is really private. Mm-hmm, and so even though I can make a justice argument about it, I don't want the government deciding, telling anyone that they have to take birth control or that they can't take birth control.
Gotcha.
So, there are these trade-offs. And so, my sense is, yes, maybe it costs us more money because people have diabetes. But the cost in money is trivial compared to the cost in liberty of deciding that because they're costing us more money, we are now entitled to, start controlling their bodies in these really fundamental ways, or controlling their environment as a proxy for controlling their bodies. I don't think the government should be deciding what the right body is, and then that kind of thing. And then I think there's a lot of just sort of I think markets almost always do better than central planning, just in terms of producing good outcomes, because of the information problem, and because it's way too detailed to get into, but public choice theory of all the ways in which government itself gets captured by various interests. And so, things like national health care, it's interesting to me how many economists arguing for national health care, they talk about national health care markets in a way that they talk about health care markets in a way that they would be ashamed to talk about any other market. And I'm not talking about things that are market arguments. There are some market arguments, something called adverse selection, for example, that are genuine economic arguments. But they make arguments about things like pharmaceuticals where like, we don't want these Me Too drugs. This is wasted money. In what other industry would they say, we don't want Me Too products. We want one kind of steel and one kind of like, Triscuit, and everyone is going to eat bologna and that's going to be our only processed meat. Like, in every other area, they recognize that a proliferation of products and competition is good, that having more choice is good. But somehow when it comes to national health care, like, we get obsessed with making these arguments about things like Me Too drugs, where they say that, people won't consume more health care if it's free. Because in every other market, if you make something free, people consume more of it. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be water, which is practically free for people on the East Coast anyway. They still use more of it if it's free. So all of these arguments, they just act in these bizarre ways, and it's because you have this desire to, they look at people who don't have health care and they feel pity, and so they want to come up with a way that something is better than the market, right? Like if the government is actually better at this than the market, it just makes everything much easier.
So I have a very unwonky question for you.
Sure.
Did you lose any friends?
What?
Did you lose any friends when your politics switched?
Yeah, I lost some friends.
How many friends did you lose? Did you have to totally change? Is that the reason you left? Well, I guess it happened before you left New York. So.
Yeah, no, it happened. It really happened before I moved to New York. Although I still progressed. I think, right. And in just other ways, I think I've actually, in weird ways, gotten more moderate. I'm still pro-choice, but I'm more moderate on abortion than I was. I'm more like. I used to be like, I don't understand how anyone can want to control a woman's body, and now I sort of see it as this really, really difficult choice between a woman's right to control her body and a fetus's right to get born, and I think that it's just really difficult. Right. And so I've gotten a lot more sort of understanding of people who don't happen to have, grown up on the East Coast and share the sort of values I was raised with. But yeah, it definitely has cost me. I remember being out on a date that was set up by a friend who didn't know my politics a couple years ago. And it was going actually pretty well until... Oh, God. What did you say? Now, I didn't say anything. Now, I should say, I voted for George Bush, which was a colossal mistake. So, it was a colossal mistake. I'm not defending it in any way. But, but I had voted for him. Right. And at the time, this was 2005. So this guy was maybe 2006. So
Wait, so you voted for him in 2000 and 2004?
No, I voted for Gore in 2004. Oh. Actually, I
so
don't
you
think
voted for Gore in 2000 and Bush in 2004?
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
I don't think I legally voted. I didn't get my absentee ballot in time, so I borrowed someone else's New York absentee ballot, which I'm not sure worked.
See, I would have had more sympathy for you had you voted for Bush in 2000 and not in 2004.
I plead temporary insanity.
It's all right. Go ahead. I'm just messing with you. Go ahead.
But the thing was, so this guy was like, well, of course I've been in mourning since Bush was elected. And I was like, okay, and I just sort of let it, because I'm used to New York to passing. I'm really good at passing as a liberal. Right. Oh yeah, I was totally in the closet on the Upper West Side. I used to actually kind of take a perverse pleasure in being at a coffee party and being able to, without lying, strongly imply that I agreed with all the people I was talking to. And so I was, I just sort of nodded, and he was and he stared at me. He was like, of course we're in mourning, aren't we? I was like, this is not going to go well.
Are you a Seinfeld fan at all?
I have never watched Seinfeld.
Okay, so I'm not going to tell a Seinfeld joke. I'll just let that be. Part of me and Kenyatta's communication is basically The Simpsons and Seinfeld, so I'll just let that be. Now, I had a very interesting transition also because I came up as a complete. I guess I was never complete because my dad was all, in my house, I imagine it was very similar in your house just listening to you talk. I came up in a sort of a quasi-black nationalist background, and though a lot of that is still with me, critical thinking was very much prized in my house. So, for instance, we didn't celebrate Kwanzaa. Firstly, everybody I knew celebrated Kwanzaa. We didn't celebrate Kwanzaa. It's the weird thing. My dad would be making these arguments about why Kwanzaa was awful. At the same time, while he was making an argument for why Christmas was awful, both at the same time.
Did you celebrate anything? Hanukkah?
No. We didn't celebrate anything. We didn't celebrate anything at all. And my dad had a very detailed argument for why, we shouldn't celebrate anything. Kwanzaa was for people who couldn't take not celebrating Christmas. It was a fake, Christmas for people who weren't really hard enough to, part with Christmas. Which is very interesting because I celebrate Christmas now. Mostly
it's
because
such a happy holiday.
You said what?
It's a happy holiday.
It is a happy holiday, although I'm very sympathetic to his reasons for not celebrating it. I mean, I think if I was single, I probably would not. But being a family man now, I think it's a bad thing to do to kids. But what I was going to say is, I went to Howard, which was like, at the point I got there, it was certainly a huge community of, black nationalism there. And, like I said, I'm very sympathetic to, much of the aims of those, who believe that way. It completely broke me out of it. It was so weird, you know what I mean? It completely and totally broke me out of it. And my politics, just really, really changed. Though I still have a lot of friends and people who are older than me who I'm very thankful from that period. My friends definitely changed. My friends, totally changed. The type of woman I dated changed. It was a complete sort of alteration. But, I like to think, that I guess I could be friends with somebody who thought gay marriage was abominable, and that women shouldn't have the right to be chosen. I guess I try to cultivate that on the blog, but I don't know how much that's possible. It's a very sad thing.
I think for me, a lot of it is, it's funny you saying that, is like, in a way, I think I just got impatient with the left at college. And I still question things like demonstrations, right? Like, demonstrations are fun, and they make me feel good.
Right.
The problem is I don't actually think they're very effective. I think they're very rarely effective.
I think that was one of my big disagreements right there. I mean, I went to the Million Man March, but kind of half-heartedly, which wasn't even a demonstration. But, yeah, I was very much in the same, spirit. Like, I'm not sure what this... It almost feels nostalgic. Like, demonstrations felt nostalgic more than anything.
It was really fun, but I felt like, the civil rights worked because what you had was a bunch of people in their Sunday clothes getting mowed down by animals with, like people acting like animals with fire hoses.
Right.
But that's not what most demonstrations are like now, right? Like, it's basically like, this is what the people
No
with
Sunday clothes and no animals with fire hoses.
Yeah, but so you go out, right, and you chant slogans, and you have bush puppet dolls, and, it ends up being like, even if there are normal, respectable people there, I shouldn't say respect, some of my best friends have purple hair, but even if there are people who look mainstream there, the dominant image is always the sock puppet people, and it's not just the media. Those are the people who are like, they're out front, right? They're the most noticeable because they don't look like everyone else, and so the message that it often sends is, this is what the people with purple hair are against. And for a lot of America, I feel like, whatever the people with purple hair are against, I'm for. So now I know what I'm for, which is what they're demonstrating against. And also I think, in general, like, also the thing about the civil rights movement, right, was that it was incredibly religious and it was incredibly not angry in a way, right? Like, it wasn't people demanding as much as it was, like, sort of just being and saying, like, I have a right to be here. But there wasn't screaming from the civil rights marchers, right? In general. Like, that changed in the late 60s and so forth. But I feel like that model, like, people have gotten caught up in the early they've gotten caught up in the achievements of the early civil rights movement, but they associate it with the achievements of the late civil rights movement.
It should also, though, be added that lefties haven't cornered the market on protesting. I mean, there's certainly, plenty of...
But those were the people I was with, were the people who were and it was like... And for the community, it was really fun. Like, protesting I'm sure you know, right? It's a bonding experience. You go out and you do this thing, and you're young, and, like, you're sticking it to the powers that be. But I felt like there were just all of these things where, like, the effectiveness was sort of secondary to the ideal. Right. So, like, the important thing was to want the right thing, and then... And, that's certainly true. I get impatient with that strain in the libertarians, too. I don't want to... But I just felt like the activist movement, for me, had come to center too much around believing the right thing instead of, like, getting the right thing done. And, they would get angry if you questioned whether X, Y, or Z would work. And so... It was on college, so of course it was going to be juvenile. But it wasn't what I had... It wasn't what I had expected to get out of it.
The one thing...
As part of it.
The one thing I will say on that, though, is, and this is you're gonna definitely disagree with this, but I do regret not going to any of the anti-war marches, or not marching at all. I do wish I had marched, I think. Because I think there is something to be said for saying publicly, I am against this, if in fact you were. I know you weren't against it, at that point. But It may not be now. I'm not sure, but
I think that one of the main reasons I regret having voted for Bush in 2004 is that I think that the war has obviously turned out to be a colossal mistake that has cost America. I mean, forget what it's cost Iraq. Just in what it's cost America in terms of like our power abroad and so forth is devastating.
And you know what? It's not even so much. I guess that I regret not thinking more critically about it. Like I regret just sort of looking at it and saying, I'm vaguely anti-war, not really, really anti-war. But he is a really bad guy, so, okay. Like, I just wish I had thought more about it. You know what I mean? And so, I don't know. And I wish I had felt more for, what was actually happening. I think, and I don't know if this is just, the Ghost of Desert, storm, and that being, the way it went down, sort of just hanging over everything and being like, oh, it's not really going to be that big of a deal. I wish I had thought more about war. I really do.
I wish a lot of things. I wish I had thought more about how the Iraqis were going to see it. I mean, like, one of the things I just didn't sort of think about was that for the Iraqis, no matter how much they wanted Saddam gone, having us march in there and get rid of him was nationally humiliating.
That's right.
I didn't think about... I totally... Like, I thought he had WMD because I was like, well, if he's acting the way I would if I were a megalomaniacal dictator. But I'm not a megalomaniacal dictator. And so saying, like, projecting myself and saying, well, this is, I vastly overestimated my ability to, like, analyze someone else's behavior in a situation that isn't really very, sort of contiguous with mine. And I also, like, I think that, honestly, I was caught up in what I think a lot of America was caught up with, was this feeling that, like, we just wanted to do something gigantic as a result of 9/11, and I'm ashamed of that.
How liberal of you.
That's not, I agree. Like, it wasn't a good emotion, and I'm ashamed of it, and it certainly wasn't a good reason to go to war. I have no excuse for it. It happened.
Right.
But I certainly, the next time, would, if, God willing, there will be no next time, but if something like that were to happen again, I would interrogate all of those things in myself much more closely than I did.
Right.
I think those are the sort of the three main things that I took away, is those are the three big errors that I made.
Right.
So, I don't know if I would have demonstrated for the same reason. Like, I just felt like the anti-war protests were doing more harm than good. And I still think that they did more harm than good precisely for that reason. They were theater. And they were theater that just made sort of middle America angrier.
But do you think people who were actually in those marches, I mean, I know plenty of, responsible, smart, people who went to those marches. I don't think they thought of it as theater. I think they actually thought, I'm publicly stating my beliefs. Someone has to stand up and say, no, I mean, no one in Congress is going to, well, I mean, some people in Congress, but the powers that be aren't doing that. So I think it's important that it be said that this wasn't done on my behalf, that I want to show the rest of the world. I mean, is it fair to hold them responsible for people who come out in blue hair? I mean, it's always going to be a blue hair element. Not that there's anything wrong with blue hair.
I'm not holding them responsible. I guess what I think, though, is, like, those are the people, and, Jim Henley, for example, complained about this, because Jim Henley is a very middle American guy. He went to the marches, and we disagreed strongly about this.
Right.
Partly Answer, which is really a loathsome organization, was organizing a lot of those marches, and they were picking the speakers. Mm-hmm. So your body lent credibility to those speakers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Whether you wanted it to or not, the count was saying, these people, and you can say, like, well, I don't support them, but that's, like, there's some limit on what you can expect, like, people to sort of break down. What people break down out of marches is body count and who's up front.
Right.
And I think more generally, like, the people with the purple hair on the sock puppets are the eye-catching people. And so people would say the media focuses on those folks. And, like, first of all, I saw some of the anti-war protests, and they weren't exactly, like, a minority. I mean, I would say that the number of people who looked like they lived in the suburbs and, drove an SUV on the weekends was pretty low, at least in New York. But also, yes, the theater people are the people who get picked out. That's true of anything. Like, you pick out they picked out, most of these blogs picked out the most loathsome anti-war supporters, most loathsome war supporters, and acted as if those were, like, the majority. So I feel like your body gives this sense that, like, almost like there's this army of people with purple hair who's coming to tell America, like, what to do. And I think, marching is theater, and theater is sometimes good. I mean, I think that what civil rights did and what Gandhi did was incredibly effective theater.
Well, that was great effort. Like, I mean, in the civil rights movement, it's funny that I'm just going to cut it really quick. There was great effort to keep that element out. I mean, and sometimes like what people always forget is Rosa Parks was not the first person to sit down.
She was the test case.
Yeah, she was the best person that they could find. That look, this old woman who just wanted to get home. There are plenty of people otherwise with maybe disturbing reasons now who also sat down who were not the test case.
Well, and it's bizarre because sometimes you'll get like conservatives on her birthday. Someone came out, some conservative side, I don't remember what it was like, well, she was actually picked to do this by the NAACP. It was like. And who cares? I don't care if they came up with a marching band and put her on the bus. She sat her ass down where she wasn't supposed to be, and she went to jail for it. Are these people
supposed to not be strategic? Like, are they supposed to be stupid? I mean,
it's a brave thing to do. Like, it doesn't matter whether you did it on purpose or just because you were tired. It was incredibly brave to get up there and risk jail. So but that's the thing is that the civil rights movement and Gandhi. Both of those movements had incredibly good sense of what made good theater, of what, and I say theater, not in any contemptuous way. They were demonstrating for America what segregation meant. And the way that they did that was that they made sure that they looked like ordinary people, just like you and me, who are getting mowed down with a fire hose for walking. And that was incredibly effective. And Gandhi was incredibly effective for the same reason. You had people who were getting mowed down for doing something that they had a perfect right to do.
Right.
And the problem is, that it moved from effective theater to expressive, an expressive thing for the left or for the right. I mean, and instead of it being about what is strategically going to make my argument the best way, it became how do I express what I feel. And that, I think, did more harm than good, because the entire debate was so angry.
I know we're running over here, but I have to say, that probably is my biggest disagreement with Move On. With the general betray us at, it's just okay, who are you supposed to convince with that? Who's going to see that? And be that's it. I'm going to, now I'm going to be an anti-war, I just, you're not really, who's going to be swayed by that? That, how convincing is that, for your target audience? So, I totally got that. I do.
Yeah, we are definitely over, so she would probably get off. But this was an awesome conversation, and I hope that I will see you when you're in D.C. soon. And I hope to persuade you to move to D.C. because see how happy I am. You were sad to leave Aspen, and I was happy to get home. So
DC no, you have an advocate in my household for moving to D.C., so that may well happen.
We are eagerly awaiting you. But until then, take care, and goodbye, Internet.
Likewise. Thank you. Talk to you soon, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.